Welcome back to Everything Creative. My name is Rich Sutton. I'm here with Minnie-Mae Wilding Diaz. It's good to have you here with us today. So tell us about yourself, including your background.
Well, if you want to know everything, that will take quite a bit of time. I was raised in Idaho with 8 siblings. I'm the oldest of 9 children in total. My parents are both deaf, and all of my siblings are also deaf. Their levels of hearing vary, and some can hear more than others, but they are all deaf. I was not raised with all of my siblings. When I went to Gallaudet, my youngest 4 siblings were only 5, 3, and about 1, and the youngest was not even born yet. In fact, my youngest sibling was born during my junior year at Gallaudet University. Even though I did not have a chance to live with them while we were growing up, we did get to see each other often. Anyway, I went to Gallaudet University my entire collegiate career, and I graduated from there. I worked for a while in Washington, D.C., and then I moved to Texas and worked with a small community college for the deaf called Southwest Collegiate Institute for the Deaf. I worked there for 3 years, and during my time there, I met my husband. We started dating, and he converted to the church, and a year later, we got married in the Salt Lake Temple. After that, I enrolled in graduate school at BYU and got my master's degree in teaching English as a second language. I then began teaching ASL. I taught ASL for 23 years, and then I retired just 2 years ago. I taught ASL to hearing and deaf students. Deaf students would typically enroll in the advanced level ASL courses. I also taught English to the deaf. And I have lived in Utah for about 22 years now, and today my husband and I are celebrating our 21st wedding anniversary. I have 3 deaf children. The oldest is a daughter, she's 13, and then I have a son, and he's 12, and the youngest is a daughter, and she's almost 11.
That's great. So you taught for 23 years, and that's a long time. Did you prefer teaching ASL or English?
I preferred teaching ASL for several reasons, primarily because it is my language, and I love and enjoy my language. Also, my students were usually at the same level of signing ability, and they could progress in their abilities together. However, my experience teaching English was different because the English abilities of each of my deaf students were so varied that I had to adapt my lessons and find new materials that would meet the needs of individual students. I usually taught remedial English, so it was an experience that was always changing. For a few years, I taught English 101 and was able to follow the university syllabus. That was sometimes difficult given the students' varied English abilities, but I enjoyed it. I always wondered if it was worth it after the first semester.
That's true. So, okay, you taught hearing students ASL. I want to know what are some of your experiences that you've had when your students who have probably not had much experience with ASL or deafness, when they meet you, their teacher, and a deaf person for the first time?
Most of the time, it has been just fine. However, it is important that I, as the teacher, set the right classroom environment from the first day. This includes me not talking, but signing, and some gesturing and writing my name on the chalkboard. It is a very slow and repetitive process, but they eventually start to grasp it and progress. Sometimes after class, a few students will come up to me and communicate with me by writing notes, and they ask me if I'm hearing or deaf, and I tell them that I'm deaf. I can't think of a time when I had a serious problem. I've had many things that have surprised me, but no real problems.
I can just imagine your students and their shock as you're not talking to them, but using your hands. Probably something they eventually got used to and better with.
A person always learns faster from not using their voice in class. One thing that my students did usually get away with is when they would whisper in class. Sometimes I caught them, but usually I would not see them doing it, or I would just ignore it because it wasn't worth my time. I figured it was their choice if they wanted to learn, and the best way to learn was by working with each other and not talking. Also, when the time came to take a test, they would be caught then if they weren't before, based on their performance. I recall a few problems I had, one in particular with a girl from Japan. She was a very good signer, but she couldn't read English very well. Because of that, she couldn't answer the questions on the test. So I tried different approaches in testing her knowledge of ASL without using English. This was a challenge. Another problem I encountered was with a boy who had a learning disability. He could sign just fine, but he could not write in English, so we had to make some adaptations. I have never been bored with teaching. It has always been a pleasure.
Those are great experiences. Now we're going to shift to a new topic. When did you start translating from English to ASL? What were some of your experiences in the translation process?
I probably started when I was in high school. Not that I was formally translating then, but I would watch interpreters knowing beforehand what the English phrase or sentence was, and I would think of a way that that phrase could have been translated better or differently. I didn't use interpreters much while I was in college, so I didn't really think about it much then. But when I started to translate the Book of Mormon, I was called first in 1989. I already knew how to gloss. During my early translation work on the Book of Mormon, I realized that glossing the translation would be difficult. I started out glossing the translation by hand and then giving it to a friend to type it out on the computer. This caused many problems because the lines on my handwritten gloss and her typed gloss didn't match up. I ended up with handwriting my gloss and keeping it in a linear gloss. I was initially called in 1989, but because of some challenges, we didn't really start until about 1994, or actually it was 1993. So there was a 4-year period that I struggled and modified what I was doing to make it just right. During that time, I was working with Jack Rose in temple translation, and that helped me a lot in my scripture translation work. Working with Jack Rose at that time was great because he had been involved with translation work previously and had many ideas and a lot of experiences that he shared with me. Having all of that experience really helped me as we finally started to work on the ASL translation of the Book of Mormon. I was able to look at what the verse really meant in English, think about how to translate it into ASL, and then write that translation in a gloss format. So my formal translation work really began in 1991, 1992.
Wow. So I would love for you to share with us maybe some of the experiences or stories that you had during your translation of the Book of Mormon that gave you a different perspective.
Well, there were a few things. For example, translating is obviously a very different process than interpreting. One of the things I like about translating is that I'm able to go at my own pace and follow the natural speed of my language. This is different than interpreting, where you sometimes have to hurry your pace to match the speed of the speaker. However, temple translation was an exception to that because you had to translate and then also match the timing of the audio. With translating the Book of Mormon, there was no audio involved or timing that I had to follow, so I was able to follow my own pace based on the natural rhythm of ASL. I really enjoyed that. There was also some cultural things that I had to take into account as I translated. As an example, there's a phrase in Joseph Smith history where Joseph writes, "Moroni called me by name." The first problem is that ASL doesn't have passive voice like English does. Well, I guess that isn't passive voice, but anyway, I had to figure out why Moroni called Joseph by name. Within deaf culture, we do not use a person's name to get their attention. We wave to get their attention.
It's true.
That is, unless they're far away or not paying attention, and then we ask someone near them to get their attention by saying something like, "Do you mind telling Bob to look at me?" But in direct communication, we would never say, "Bob." Knowing that deaf people call on each other by waving and wanting to keep the translation as literal as possible without adding explanations, as well as making it culturally understandable, I translated it as, "He spoke my name." and then I added a wave.
That really makes sense. That's cool.
I did that to show that he was said the name in order to call on him. That was one experience I had, but there were several other times that I had to really work hard to make sure the translation was literal and culturally understandable. One of the biggest concerns I had was with the use of space. For example, when the Book of Mormon makes reference of going to Zarahemla, where do I point for the direction of Zarahemla? Is it north, south, east, or west? I had no idea. The Book of Mormon really doesn't give directional references. Well, sometimes it gives us a north or a south direction, but most of the time it doesn't. So what I did was use the seminary map. I knew it wasn't exact, but it was a visual aid that we used and to have a reference of where to point when we were referring to a city like Ammonihah or Mulek. I struggled with the names of people, and even the heights of people. I assumed for this purpose that they were all the same height. I had to visually establish cities and people and then use role shifting to establish conversations between the people. As an example, when a person was speaking to the Lord, they spoke up and to the right. And when the Lord would speak to someone, he spoke down and to the left.
The really interesting thing for me is that it took you 10 years to finish the translation of the Book of Mormon, right? 11 years to finish it. And during that time, you had 2 children born. Is that right? 3. Wow. So how did all of that work out? How were you able to do that?
Well, that was one of the reasons why it took so long to finish. The first 4 years, I didn't get a lot done. My focus first shifted to the Temple translation. Then my focus was shifted to graduate school, which lasted until I graduated in 1993. But it was during that time that I started to understand my role as a translator and how I was going to accomplish my task. Also during that time, I had a new supervisor, Terry Moyer, assigned to me from the translation department. He really helped me out tremendously. It really made a difference when we were put into the right place, the right department, and with the right supervisor. He had worked with deaf people before, and he knew my father, so that helped to get the work moving forward. We finally started filming in 1994, and from that point forward, the work progressed. My first child was born in 1995, and I also started a full-time job that same year. So it still took a long time because I could not completely focus on the translation of the Book of Mormon. There were times when I was completely focused on the work for a few months, and then my focus would switch to something else for a few months, and then back to the Book of Mormon for a while, then to having another baby, and then back to translating. Between all 3 of my children being born, work, and everything else, the translation was finally completed during the Christmas season of 2000. So from January of 1989 until then, it took almost exactly 11 years.
Wow. Were you ever pregnant while you were actually filming?
Once I was pregnant with my 3rd child.
Could you tell? Like when you watch yourself, can you tell?
No, you really couldn't tell.
That's so interesting. So during those 11 years, did you completely translate it before you filmed it, or did you translate a portion, then film a portion, and so on until you finished?
We tried to translate it all and have it done before we filmed, but it was just too much. In hindsight, we could have done it. No, it was just too much. We had to translate a portion and then film it until we were done. There were also other factors. First Nephi, for example, was great. I had it all ready to go and had it memorized, and the filming went very well. But as the project progressed, I was under time constraints, which made me rush to meet deadlines I was given. There were times that in order to meet the deadline, I had to finish translating the night before we filmed. The problem with that was that the filming did not go as smoothly and took longer. It is also hard to describe facial expressions in written format, so I had to simply memorize the facial expressions that went along with what was the written translation. That was the process we used.
Did you use a teleprompter?
Yes, we had 3 cameras, one in the center and one on each side, and each of the 3 cameras had teleprompters, so I could see the teleprompter when I shifted from side to side. If I were to do it again, I would have 9 teleprompters, 3 in the center, 3 in the right, and 3 on the left, eye level above and below. With that setup, I could shift, set up different characters, and look wherever I wanted and not limited to 3 positions. It would have been nice to have more flexibility to look wherever I needed to.
Boy, that story was really fascinating. So you mentioned that before you really got started in 1989 to 1993, during that time you began to understand what you were supposed to do. What specifically did you learn that helped you?
I think what I learned was the process of what I was doing. I really felt like we were trying to reinvent the wheel. We tried to set up a committee of translators. We tried sign writing, which I think is a cool piece of technology, but it was too new. Finally, we went back to the traditional way of translating and kept it basic. We began to ask Terry, our supervisor, what we were supposed to do and what was the process that other languages followed. He told us step by step, and we followed the process, and it was a lot better after that. Prior to that time, it seemed like we were given the project and left alone. We really struggled at first because we did not know what to do, but after we knew what to do, it got better. One realization was that I had to become the head translator. This meant that I would do all of the translating and not have a committee of translators. There really is not one right way to translate. Everyone has their own style and language. But it was decided that I would be the translator. It was an interesting experience.
So now that you're done with that project and you can look back, while you're watching the DVD, do you find yourself criticizing yourself or...
Oh, I still can't watch myself. When I read the Book of Mormon, I still find myself translating it in my head. It's been 9 years and I'm still translating it. Even with the other books of scriptures that I read, like the Doctrine and Covenants, or for example, now I am reading the Pearl of Great Price, and I end up reading the scripture and then thinking, how would I translate this verse? And then I find myself translating and signing the scriptures to myself. Back to your question, maybe I have not tried to watch myself enough. Maybe now I could watch myself. I would definitely see things that I would want to change and find facial expressions that could have been better.
I notice that when I'm watching my own sign, and I'm always criticizing myself, and I just wondered if you did the same.
If people ask me if I am content with the translation work I did, I would probably say that I'm 90% satisfied with it. Even though it is not perfect, translation is hard, and it's hard to match the English exactly. The Book of Mormon in English is the most correct book in the world, and I tried to come as close as I could to the English and feel good because I know the Spirit was there. I know that it was not my work, it was the Spirit's work. There were many things that I could not have done by myself. Yes, there were a few places where it could have been better, but I'm satisfied.
I feel really touched just because I've heard the testimony from the translator of the Book of Mormon in ASL, so I just want to thank you for sharing that with us. I know that my mom loves the Book of Mormon in ASL. She's able to watch it and understand it and enjoy it.
I saw your mom at church a few months ago, and she was very nice to me and expressed her appreciation to me for the work that I did. A few people have shared similar feelings with me, and it is very nice.
I'm sure this makes you feel good to know that even though it was a challenge to translate, people appreciate the work that you have done. So now I kind of want to shift gears again and focus on your experience growing up deaf, with deaf parents, in a totally deaf family, and attending schools for the deaf. All of the listeners to this radio program can hear. And so I want to ask you to share with us your experiences with deaf schools, including Gallaudet. I remember recently attending a workshop that you put on about deaf music and how that is different from how people who can hear think about music. So I'd like to hear the story of your upbringing, especially as it relates to deaf schools, Gallaudet, and other experiences you've had.
Well, my experience at deaf schools while I was growing up was probably different from most other deaf students because I was a day student. I commuted from home to school and back and never lived in dorms. I was able to live at home and either ride my bike to school or walk. It wasn't that far at all. In fact, my father taught at the school, so we lived in the same town. Most of my friends lived in the dorms. I really feel like I missed out on that opportunity. They had a lot of fun during the night. They would get together every night after dinner and have fun while I was at home. In fact, I was not allowed to come during the night to play with my friends in the dorm because I was at home with my family. It was hard because all of my friends were at school and I didn't have any friends near my house, so it was kind of strange.
Was it your parents or the school that didn't allow you to go back?
It was the school that didn't allow me to go back at night. After a while, though, they began to change the rule, and the school allowed my younger brothers and sisters to go to the school at night, and they were much more involved than I was. For me, attending deaf school was like any typical public school. The only exception was that all my teachers signed. The things I learned in school were the same as hearing students were learning in their schools. I really learned a lot and was able to progress and grow. I still remember things from 2nd and 3rd grade. My teachers were really good teachers. I remember that one teacher really loved horses and taught us all about them. The different breeds, the different gaits, trot, gallop, and so on. It is funny, the silly things that I remember, but it is because of my excellent teachers, so that's my experience growing up. Now, focusing on sound and the use of sound, there is a book titled Deaf in America, and there is a good chapter in that book. I think it's chapter 6. I used that book a lot when I taught ASL. That book and chapter explain the different perspectives of sound. For example, I remember when I was in school, we would have track practice, or was it cross country? It was track. Anyway, when we were done, all the group of girls would go and shower and had big open showers, and walls and the floors were all very wet. Because of that, it was a good place to make noise. We found out through experiences that water was very good at carrying sound, and it was really cool. We would yell, and specifically yell into the corners of the wet walls. For us, the louder yelling meant the deeper the sound. We weren't as good as the boys were. They could make it so loud that you could really feel it. You have to understand, we didn't hear anything with our ears, but we felt it in our chests. We girls would only do that every once in a while, but the boys would do it all the time, every day. We would yell in the showers and in the dorms. I missed out on the yelling in the dorms because I wasn't there. If you look at it from the perspective of a person who can hear, they would think of it and view that as awful behavior. But we weren't yelling for any real purpose. It was just yelling for no reason. We would just scream, "Ah!" and then it was it. Our view of perspective of sound, the deepness of it, we like the boom of the bass sound. This is related to rhythm, and we like the sounds that have a strong rhythm. For example, pianos and trumpets and other instruments like that do not appeal because it is hard to feel the rhythm. We do, however, like drums, electric guitars, and instruments that have a strong bass rhythm. Our school cheer, in fact, would be based on a definite rhythm. It was very common to have a 3-part rhythm, 1, 2, 3, or a famous deaf rhythm, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. This is basically what I discussed in my deaf music workshop. Maybe we could call it deaf rap. Who knows? Our school cheers were usually based on those rhythms. When I went to Gallaudet, the fight song had a little different rhythm. It went like this. Everybody, or at least almost everyone, seemed to love the rhythm of that song and that of the President's song. I discovered that many schools for the deaf have fight songs that are based on similar rhythms. What I am now trying to do is to apply that rhythm to storytelling. I love telling stories to children, not so much to adults. I enjoy telling children's stories. The only problem is that the rhythm is a better fit with adults because children don't understand it yet. I really enjoy telling stories. Do you want me to show you an example of a story?
Yes, please, that'd be great.
Okay, it goes like this. Now, time, story, story. 3 bears. Wait, that's not right. Let me try to remember how it goes. Now, time, story, story, story. Story, what? Bear, bear, bear. There, house, tree, tree, tree. So you start to see the rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. I enjoy trying to be creative and match different stories with the rhythm. I have performed that story about 3 times, and the response has been very positive. I'm trying to get that message out in the mainstream. In fact, if you watch old deaf films, you will see that they have and use that rhythm. I could go on and on about the history that is involved, but basically the rhythm was used in the past and then it stopped being used over time. One of the reasons that the number of deaf schools decreased, and deaf students were mainstreamed into public schools. Another reason is that English was given the primary focus and we lost the tradition of our language. I am trying to bring back some of those and maybe add some new ones. I think it's really fun.
So you mentioned briefly the reduction in the number of deaf schools, more mainstream enrollment of deaf students in public schools, and a greater focus on English. What are your feelings about all of that?
Well, I think there are pros and cons to both sides of that issue. I was mainstreamed in the public school during the last 3 years of high school. I learned a lot, and it was beneficial for me. I think that I did so well because I already had a foundation from growing up in a deaf school, and I already had established an identity. I have seen many children who grew up mainstreamed in their entire lives in the public school, and they do not have an identity or know who they are as a deaf person. There are a lot of children who miss out on a lot of things growing up mainstreamed, things such as social skills and being involved in church. Many deaf people, boys especially, go to the MTC at age 19 not even knowing who Joseph Smith is. This happened because they missed out on a lot while growing up. We need to accept ASL and English both. Yes, of course, English is important, but they need both languages. Some public schools have large groups of deaf students, and I think that is fine. But most public schools only have one deaf student in their entire school, and they are alone and lost in a sea of people who can hear. For deaf people, for lack of a better word, disability is not a physical thing. Yes, it affects the ears, but their disability or struggle in life is not physical. It is a lack of communication. If you cannot communicate, how are you supposed to learn? To develop your identity, to develop self-esteem, develop relationships. The list can go on and on and on.
Your focus was mostly on your experience at a deaf school while you were growing up. I'm wondering if you could tell us more about your experience at Gallaudet. I'm sure there weren't many members of the church there, and I'm curious what your experience was with the church and in going to Gallaudet.
For me, coming from Idaho, in a town of only 3,000 people, a deaf school that only had 115 students, and the public high school that only had 350 students, and that's a small school. Then going to Gallaudet, where there were 2,000 students, it was a change. During my first 2 years at Gallaudet, I got lost. I got really involved, especially socially, and got too busy on Sundays with going places, studying, and being involved with so many different things. My first year, I played around a lot, and I did a lot of different things. By my sophomore year, I was involved with the SBG, Student Body Government. I was the director of student welfare. Some of my duties included the cafeteria policies, parking, and other things that affected the lives of students. During my junior year, I became the editor of the school newspaper. I really enjoyed working on that.
What was the name of the newspaper?
The Buff and the Blue. It was the school colors. Being the editor of the newspaper was fun for me. Then during my senior year, I became an RA, the head RA for the dorms, and I was also involved with the yearbook staff. So I was involved with many different things during my years at Gallaudet. I really didn't go to church much during my first 2 years, but I did attend regularly during the last 2 years. Yes, you're right, there were not a lot of members of the church there. In fact, I think there were only 5 of us at the beginning that were LDS, at least that I knew of. But the number increased from my freshman year to my senior year. During my senior year, a group of us started LDSSA, and I was one of the co-founders of that organization at Gallaudet. By the time I graduated, we had about 35 students who were involved with LDS-SA. It was too bad that I graduated by the time we had a big group. We were able to set up a carpool, which we did not have during my first 2 years. During my first 2 years, I had to have a member of the deaf branch come pick me up and drive me back to church and then drive me back to school, and it was awkward. Sometimes they would come to pick me up and we would miss on our timing and it would all be for nothing. It was tough for various reasons. During my junior year and senior year, it was really good after we established the LDS-SA. I have heard that the numbers of LDS students has gone way down now, but they do have an Institute of Religion there now, which is great. We didn't have that during my time there, except starting in my senior year, we had an institute teacher who would come and teach us once a week.
That's great. There's one thing that I've noticed at deaf schools throughout the country and at Gallaudet, and that is that sports are very important for the deaf community. Why is that?
I think it is just because sports are important, period. It is a way for us to get together and socialize with each other. As an example of that, when I go to a basketball game or a tournament, I never end up watching the game. I am always talking and chatting with people I know who are there. If you were to look into the audience, they rarely watch the game. The only exception would be if it was my team that is playing. Then maybe I would watch the game. Maybe. So I really think it's more of a social thing than a sports thing. If you think about it, we don't get together in many other settings. We don't get together for music, not for dancing. Really, that's not to say we don't like dancing. We do. We just don't get together for it. The theater is great, but there are only a few places that have deaf theater. California, Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., and that's about it. So sports are really important that way for us. If you go to a political conference like the NAD, a biannual conference, usually you will see about 2,000 people attend. However, when you take a bowling tournament, that happens every year, you will see about 7,000 to 10,000 people attend. It's a big difference. Bowling is big. The same applies to both softball and basketball, but also others are popular. Usually about 3,000 or 4,000 or 7,000 people will show up every year. It is a good place in a way to get together and socialize. People will save their money, set up carpools to get to these events.
So I'm thinking about the people who are listening to this radio program. What are your feelings with how deaf people are involved in the church? Do you feel the deaf are fully involved as part of the church, or do you feel there needs to be improvement in that area?
Well, here in Salt Lake City, we are very fortunate to have deaf wards, and that is really nice. The bishop is deaf, his counselors are deaf, and all the auxiliary leaders, Relief Society president, primary president, and basically the entire organization of the ward is deaf, or at least they can sign. It is a place where we can interact with one another and feel very involved. My calling right now is to be the ward chorister, which really confuses a lot of people who find that out, but I love my calling. In relationship to being connected with the church as a whole, or church headquarters, I think it could be better. However, it has improved a lot. With the addition of you in the translation department, more deaf people are involved in the work. More ASL resources are available on the internet, and that's great. It always could be better in general. I have ideas I would like to submit. The problem I see is that each stake is presided by a stake presidency. Each area is presided by area authorities, and so on. That organization works great. But when it comes to the deaf community, boundaries are usually not set in one stake or area. That sometimes causes conflict. Conflict isn't the right word. It's more that things are not done the same way for all deaf people. the services provided for the deaf at one temple are not the same as provided at another temple. If I go to the Washington, D.C. branch, I feel totally included in that branch. It is no different than here at all the deaf units. We in Salt Lake have a deaf high counselor, and they don't. They might have a high councilman who can sign, but not a high counselor who is deaf. Last week I went to the Twin Falls, Idaho temple for a special training meeting. There were about 30 temple workers and about 15 deaf people. They wanted to know how to work with the deaf. I went because my parents were recently called as temple workers there. They do their work through interpreters. And it works out fine, and they feel great about it. But here we have deaf ordinance workers that do the ordinances themselves and have direct communication with the patrons.
So you said they're okay with that. Are you saying that the temple workers are okay with that, or that the deaf are okay with it?
Deaf people are okay with it. They haven't really experienced a different way. I felt okay with it. There were only 2 deaf ordinance workers right now. That compared with Jordan River, Utah Temple, where there are 30 deaf ordinance workers.
So we've talked about a lot of different things during this interview. In your life, what have you done that has made you feel more creative? When you translate, do you feel creative? What makes you feel creative?
Yes, I think I feel most creative when I am trying to think of stories in ASL that match a particular rhythm. I really enjoy that. I feel creative when I do that, and it is possibly the only creative art I have. In any other way, I am not artistically inclined.
Yeah, me neither.
Often, when I teach ASL classes, I have to be creative. Students will ask how I would sign a specific sentence or phrase, or I will sign something that they don't understand, and I will not tell them the word. Instead, I will creatively think of ways to describe that word without telling them what it is. Sometimes we would try for a while, and then finally I would just have to tell them the word. For example, the word abstract. I would sign the word abstract and try to explain what abstract is. I would knock on my desk to show something tangible and then say that is not it, but it's too hard and that doesn't make sense, so I would just tell them what the word is. There are other signs that I can't really think of right now that really caused me to be creative in how I describe what that sign was. I really enjoy being creative while I taught ASL. I really feel creative in those moments.
Do you find yourself being creative with your kids? Do you use your deaf music and stories with them?
I don't like to.
Why not? Because you're their mom? Or?
They're too young. The rhythm doesn't make sense to them yet. I taught a workshop about deaf music to a group of youth. It seemed that there were some who showed interest, but others acted like, so what? After the workshop was over, I asked my 3 kids what they thought of the workshop. They all said it was boring. There was another workshop before mine with a mime, and that was more exciting than mine. It seems that the rhythm and the deaf music is a better fit for adults.
Is it because adults have gone through deaf schools and other situations where they've experienced deaf music and the rhythm?
I don't know. Some of the deaf adults never went to deaf schools, and more now are from a mainstream background. So I don't really know why. I have looked into it and analyzed it, but I haven't found an answer yet.
Okay, so you grew up with 8 siblings who are all deaf, and you have 3 kids who are all deaf. So does that mean that your extended family, such as nieces and nephews, are also all deaf? Or are there some who can hear in your family?
Yes, there are 9 of us siblings, and there are 16 nieces and nephews, including my children. Only 4 of them can hear. All 4 of them are siblings and can hear because their mom married a man who can hear. It has always made me wonder about them being able to hear and the rest of us being deaf. Even though we are all deaf, there are varying levels of our deafness. With my 3 kids, the oldest is really hard of hearing. Let me go off subject for a minute and talk about the term hard of hearing. From the perspective of a hearing person who can hear, hard of hearing usually means deaf. It literally means a person that you have a hard time communicating with, or someone you have to yell at or speak loudly to. From a deaf perspective, a hard of hearing person means a person who can hear or can hear pretty well.
That's an interesting explanation of the 2 different perspectives.
We are coming from the perspective of a deaf person. So a deaf person has deafness at the center of their perspective. Then being hard of hearing is considered by a deaf person to be more towards being able to hear than being deaf. A person who is hard of hearing can hear, can probably talk on the phone, and probably speak well. Now, from the perspective of a person who can hear, a person who is hard of hearing is considered more towards being deaf, or a person who can't hear. Anyway, back to my point. My oldest daughter is hard of hearing and can hear pretty well. The other 2 are totally deaf like me. My brother, who has 3 kids as well, also has 1 child who is hard of hearing and the other 2 are deaf. I have a sister who has 2 kids. 1 is hard of hearing and the other is deaf. Even though there is a variety of hearing loss, 12 are considered deaf and 4 can hear. The 4 hearing nieces and nephews can't sign very well because their mom can speak well and is also hard of hearing. It is exactly what I was saying. Even though I said that all of my 8 siblings are deaf, some are hard of hearing and have a variety of hearing loss, but all are culturally deaf and some can speak. My sister, who I mentioned before, she speaks with her kids and that is why they can't sign well. However, they can sign well enough to communicate with their cousins.
So can the husband who can hear sign?
No, they got a divorce, and so he didn't continue to learn. He never really learned to sign.
That's so interesting. I guess really interesting for me because I was raised a coda, or a child of a deaf adult. I was raised being able to hear with deaf parents, and I wonder if it was a similar situation for those 4 kids who can hear to be raised in an extended family that is entirely deaf. There were times in my life where I felt like I was living in between worlds, like I didn't completely belong in the hearing world or the deaf world. I could sign, but I could also hear. I don't have the genes to pass on deafness to future generations, so now in my life I can hear, both of my kids can hear, my wife can hear. It's just interesting to see the different situations of people in the deaf community.
That makes me think how it was different for me growing up in an all-deaf family. There was a small group of us, only 8-10% of us. Most deaf people are born and raised by parents who can hear. Most deaf children are usually the only person in the family that is deaf. Whereas in my family, all of us were deaf and all of us signed. I have noticed a few differences from that. For example, if I fell down and started crying, my mom wasn't going to come to me. I had to go look for her first, and then I would start crying. In a family where everyone can hear, if the kid falls down and starts crying, they can stay where they are, and the parents will probably come running to them and hold them. Probably the same for you. If you fell, your parents couldn't hear you crying, right?
That's right.
We couldn't call each other by yelling. You would have to turn on and off the lights or walk over and tap them on the shoulder and get their attention.
Or even pound on the table.
Or pound on the table or go to another room and get their attention. Another example is the doorbell. In the house where people can hear, a doorbell can be heard clearly in every room, even in the bathroom. But in a deaf house, the light flashes on and off. And sometimes we are in a room without a light, and we end up not knowing that someone is at the door, and we don't answer the door.
That's so interesting. We've talked a lot about the difference between hearing culture and deaf culture and about being deaf. And now I kind of want to focus and talk about you. What's your driving force? What really makes you move forward in life?
I think it is my family, my children. You asked me earlier how I am creative with my kids. Well, what I tried to do is to be creative with things like family home evening. I try to make them short and sweet because right now they are at the age when they are saying things like, family home evening, oh, do we have to? So I try to keep it short and sweet and be creative with short things that will bring the spirit into our home and bring a spirit of unity. I try to do something fun every week, like a small outing. It doesn't often happen. But I try to focus on what my kids are doing. For example, my daughter loves photography, and her pictures are very good. She also excels when it comes to writing, so I try to encourage her in her writing. Right now, she is struggling with school like everyone else her age. I also encourage her to find something that she likes to do so she can be excited and motivate herself. My son, the middle child, is fascinated by school, especially science. That was my favorite subject too. My dad taught science for 37 years, so I grew up with science. So whenever we are driving, I try to point out different rock formations in the mountains and ask my kids why it looks like that. It causes my kids to think about it and come up with an idea like an earthquake. I encourage my kids to use their heads and try to analyze things in the world around them. My youngest daughter, Isabella, is pretty young. She is the clown, and she loves to be silly. My husband is involved in making movies. I enjoy watching him do that and supporting him in that. My thing is making Christmas ornaments every year. We get together as a family and we find things to make ornaments with and we paint them. That is something creative that we can do together every year. This year I'm hoping to have a big Halloween bash. I want to involve the kids in finding things and planning it. We need to start on that pretty soon.
So, there's going to be many people in the deaf community who will watch this interview, and many people who can hear will listen to this interview on the radio. What would you like to share with them? I know people who are watching or listening will recognize you as a pioneer in the church and in church translation. What do you want to share with them, or maybe what do you want to express to them? Perhaps if you wanted to, you could even include your testimony.
Maybe I can share a story that will illustrate what I want to say. Being raised in a deaf family, having gone to deaf school, having gone to a deaf church, it wasn't a branch yet then, but a group, and having some interaction with people who can hear, I have never fully understood people who can hear. I always felt different. Then when I went to high school, I transferred to the public high school. And I was terrified. I was all alone, and I didn't know anyone. For about 3 months, it was just me and my books. I walked around with my head down, and I go to class, I watch the interpreter, and then leave. But then some of the girls in my class and I began writing notes to each other. That continued for a while, and that is when I realized that people who could hear are normal. They're just like me. That is a story that I often share with my ASL students. I want people to understand that we are all normal. It doesn't matter where we are raised, whether it be on a farm or in a city, in a small town or a big town. It doesn't matter if our skin is different colors. It doesn't matter if we have different religions or if we have a disability. We are all normal and we're all the same. Our internal needs, our desires, our motivations, and our desires for relationships are all the same. It is my feeling that we will all bring our own personal experiences to heaven. When I am brought to heaven, I will still be a deaf person with deaf experiences. Even though I will probably be able to hear physically, I will still be me. That is the same for everyone. When we talk about heaven and how we will all be perfect, it doesn't mean that we will all be the same. We will all be unique. That is how I feel. And that's what I believe.
I really think it's fascinating how you talked about realizing that people who can hear were normal. I have had that same experience with people who can hear meeting a deaf person for the first time, and they have the same experience and say that deaf people are normal. Maybe people who can hear wouldn't think that a deaf person would consider them different. Once we interact with others, we realize we're really all the same and yet all unique. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if you can hear or not, whether you can see or not, or any other difference. We are all the same.
That's right. For many people who are deaf that are raised in families that can hear, their experience is different than mine. My experience with people who can hear was more limited when I was growing up. Many deaf people feel different when they grow up in a family that can hear. But I felt normal. I had to really go a long way and get out of my comfort zone to relate with people who could hear. But that experience has helped me with my relationships today. For example, when I teach my ASL students who can hear, I see them as normal and I can relate with them. I taught at BYU, at Salt Lake Community College, at Utah Valley College, now UVU, and I couldn't involve the gospel in my teachings except at BYU. But in general, the way I related with people, the way I tried to help my students, I always felt that the gospel was part of my life and would influence them through me. At UVU, many of my students are LDS. And if the students started discussion about the church, I would usually get involved in this discussion. And I hope I always set a good example for them. I tried to show them that we are all people and that we all have common needs and we all struggle in life and that we all have to keep going.
As I'm sure you're well aware, in most languages, maybe all except signing, the translator or interpreter translates or interprets, and the people who read or listen never know who the translator or interpreter is. But for you, obviously it's different because people actually see you. I'm curious if people who meet you recognize you. Is it awkward for you when they do recognize you? Do you feel pressure because you translated the Book of Mormon and maybe people hold you to a higher standard?
Well, really, many people don't really recognize me. It will take someone telling them who I am, and then they are shocked and know it's me. People just don't recognize me, so it is not frequent that people are coming up to me. Also, I feel like when you are watching the person on the screen, that's really not me. The Spirit was very involved, and that helped me so I don't have to feel completely responsible. Don't get me wrong, it was a big responsibility, and I have to be careful of what I do and say, but I'm not perfect. I don't want to have people to be turned off by the Book of Mormon because of something I have done, or if I offend them. Most of the time it doesn't bother me too much because of the spirit that I felt there.
For me personally, I hate being on camera. I don't mind signing or interpreting in front of a big audience, but when I'm on camera, I just freeze and my signing becomes, I don't know, just bad. I just hate being on camera. But you always look and do so well on camera. I have another question kind of relating to the Book of Mormon. Did you have any special spiritual experiences or anything that you want to share with us about your translation of the Book of Mormon? Anything that maybe comes to your mind in particular as you were translating the Book of Mormon?
Yes, maybe at the beginning, but translating is very technical and a very tedious process. Generally, you look at the phrase and you know how to translate it. But there were some special experiences. During the chapters of 2nd Nephi, especially the Isaiah chapters, it was hard. I would always pray before we started translating. Even sometimes I was struggling with a particular translation, I would pray again, and then everything worked out. It was never a big inspiration or a vision or a big thing. It was more of just doing it every day.
So, was there any specific words or sentences or phrases that you really struggled with and had to study and trying to figure out how to translate it from the English into ASL because of a cultural or a language barrier, something that just really was hard to translate? Is there anything that specifically comes to mind about specific words or phrases in English that you really struggled with and then maybe had some kind of spiritual inspiration or said a prayer and then realized that's how I need to translate it? Anything like that you could share with us specifically?
Yes. There were words like I can think of the word revelation. There are many signs that members of the church have used for a long time, but they were based on English rules. And I had to think if that was accurate in ASL or not. Sometimes I had to break tradition and sign it in a different way. So, for example, I had to change the sign for revelation that had been established based on English rules to a sign that kept the meaning in ASL, that God was informing man instead of God and man talking with each other. There are a few other things like that. We had some tools to help us. If the tools didn't answer our questions, then there were people who I could call and they would answer my questions. I cannot think of a specific example right now, but we did have two wonderful committees. One was a language review committee, and the other was an ecclesiastical review committee. They were there to review my work and make sure that my work was done correctly.
So there's another thing that I wanted to ask. It's kind of personal, so bear with me. As you know, my dad grew up in Idaho and attended the school for the deaf that your father taught at. And as I was growing up, my dad always talked about your father. In fact, my dad loved science because of your father. And I remember looking up to you as I was growing up. I would love to hear your testimony. Would you mind sharing your testimony about all you have experienced with all of us that are listening?
I know you probably hear people say this all the time, but the foundation of my testimony is that I know Jesus Christ performed the atonement for me. But that's how I felt when I was growing up that Jesus performed the atonement for all of us. But what about me? What about Minnie-Mae? I didn't know that until later when I was converted, despite having been raised in the church. That part of my testimony has helped and applied to everything else. Once I knew that He had a personal knowledge of me, of my needs, my thoughts, and my concerns, I could do what I needed to do. For example, when I was working on the Book of Mormon, I felt that He knew what I was doing and what I needed, and that I needed help with that specific sentence or word. He always answered my prayers. With my own kids, I am still learning how to work with them. Every time I lose my keys, and I'm telling you I lose them a lot, He knows where my keys are. Not where every random person's keys are, but where my keys are, and I find them. I have a testimony of that. I also have a testimony of tithing, and I have a testimony of Joseph Smith. I know that he is a prophet. I know this because of a time in my life when I was the gospel doctrine teacher for several years. I remember one specific lesson on Joseph Smith, and I asked myself if I really knew he was a prophet. I prayed about it, and I studied my lesson, and while I was teaching, I knew. I have a testimony of our current prophet, Thomas S. Monson. I feel like I know him because all the other prophets I did not know as apostles. But I feel like I have known President Monson as an apostle, and now he is our prophet. It is a great experience to see him as a prophet, and somehow I feel as if I know him.
I just personally want to thank you for giving us some of your time for this interview and our discussion. I really don't even care that there are other people out there who are going to listen to this, because I have really enjoyed sitting here and talking with you and asking you questions and hearing your answers. I have really enjoyed this time with you and want to thank you for your time and let you know how much I've appreciated this opportunity. I am sure few people realize how many hours and days and weeks and months and years you sacrificed to work on the Book of Mormon, on temple projects, other books and magazines, and so many more things so that they could be translated. You've really sacrificed so much, and for that I want to say thank you. And if I could, include everyone else who would want to add their appreciation as well. Thank you for listening or watching this interview. My name is Rich Sutton, and I've been here with Minnie-Mae Wilding Diaz. We thank her for her time, and thank you for listening to Everything Creative.